Hola estudiantes, hemos llegado a una nueva lección y lo que vamos a hacer en estos 30 minutos que tenemos juntos es estudiar un nuevo tiempo verbal llamado el condicional. El condicional es bastante útil en español y va a permitirles decir muchas más cosas, así que después de esta lección ustedes podrán expresarse mejor gracias al condicional. So, as I've just mentioned, in this lesson, we're going to study a new verb tense, one that is bastante útil, rather useful, and it's called the conditional tense. Repitan, el condicional. And después de esta lección, ustedes podrán, you will be able to, podrán, as you know, is in the future, expresarse mejor. Express yourselves better. Note that expresarse is a reflexive verb, gracias al condicional, thanks to the conditional. So, I would like to introduce you to the conditional. In fact, it would be good for your Spanish if you would begin incorporating the conditional when you speak as soon as possible. Would you please do that? It would help you communicate better, and you would seem even more like someone fully in command of the Spanish language. So what can you express using the conditional? Well, as you might have guessed, the conditional communicates the idea of an action that would occur, and in general is used pretty much as we use the conditional in English. I can, for example, talk about a future desire and say something like, "We would like to visit Chile," or with more time, they would study more. So that's one use of the conditional tense, to express a future desire. The conditional is also used at times as a polite way of expressing yourself. In a store, one could say to an employee, for example, "Would you help me, please?" That use of the word would in English helps us be more polite when speaking. Once again, in general, the conditional in Spanish is used much as it is in English, either to talk about something that would be true if some future condition were met, or to be polite. There is one important thing to keep in mind when comparing English and Spanish. At times, we use would in English when talking about a repeated or habitual past action. Consider this example. When I was young, I would always play with my sister. How would you put that in Spanish? When I was young is cuando era joven, good. I would always play with my sister. Siempre jugaba con mi hermana. The whole sentence then is cuando era joven, siempre jugaba con mi hermana. So, what tense have we used here? We've used the imperfect because we're talking about what we used to do in the past. So that's something important to keep in mind about the conditional in Spanish. It expresses an action that would happen, but not in the sense of something that used to happen. In those cases of past actions, Spanish uses the imperfect and not the conditional tense. Okay, so the conditional expresses something that would happen and is used to talk about future desires or to be polite. Makes sense. That's not too hard to understand and is in fact how we use the conditional in English. So we know what it's used for. Soon we'll learn how to form it. But before getting into the conjugation of the conditional, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the 5 verb tenses we've already studied throughout our 2 Learning Spanish courses. What I'd like to focus on is how much time it's taken us to learn to conjugate verbs in each of these tenses. And I'd like to talk about this topic briefly for a few reasons. First of all, many successful language students tend to have a good sense of what they know and what they don't yet know regarding grammatical topics and vocabulary. This understanding of what you can and cannot yet do with the language is quite helpful for someone working to improve communication skills. Second, I'd like you to make the surprising point that as we move forward in our study of Spanish, the act of conjugating verbs in new tenses is actually getting easier not harder. This is counterintuitive because most language learners expect that as you study more advanced topics in a language, the material must necessarily be getting more difficult. But I'm here to tell you that in the world of verb conjugation in Spanish, the opposite is true. As we deal with verb tenses beyond the present and the preterite, which we covered extensively in our first course, we need less time to learn how to conjugate in the new tenses. For example, the first tense we looked at in our first course was the present, and that took quite a long time to learn. In fact, we spent parts of 10 lessons learning how to conjugate verbs in the present tense. Beyond learning the regular AR, ER, and IR endings, meaning there are 3 sets of regular endings in the present, we had to learn how to conjugate 4 different kinds of stem-changing verbs and remember which verbs change stems in the present and what those changes are. Then we moved on to a vast variety of verbs that are irregular in a number of different ways in the present tense. Let's consider just a few examples of irregular yo forms in the present tense. I'll give you the verb, you give me the present tense of its yo form. Ser, yo soy. Oír, yo oigo. Conocer, yo conozco. Venir, yo vengo. Contribuir, yo contribuyo. Note that you need a Y before the O. Ver, yo veo. Dar, yo doy. Saber, yo sé. Decir, yo digo. Muy bien. There are lots more verbs that are irregular in the present, but I think I've made my point that conjugating verbs in the present tense in Spanish is really quite a challenging proposition, which is why it takes so long to learn the present. Clearly, in those 10 lessons, we were doing more than just conjugating verbs in the present. We were covering other grammar topics, learning new vocabulary, and discussing cultural topics as well. Even so, the very fact that we spent parts of 10 lessons learning to conjugate verbs in the present tense gives a good indication of the great number of verbs that are irregular in different ways in the present. Toward the end of our first course, we learned the preterite tense, and that took parts of 3 lessons. You'll remember we first learned the regular endings for AR verbs, and then the special spelling changes needed in the yo form of the preterite for verbs ending in car, gar, and sar. Next, we learned the preterite conjugation for regular ER and IR verbs. Then we looked at verbs conjugated like tener, that have irregular stems in the preterite and their own special set of endings. We then discussed a number of irregular verbs in the preterite, including ser, ir, dar, ver, as well as the preterite conjugation of verbs ending in UIR and verbs like creer. Lastly, we learned about stem-changing IR verbs that change stem in the third person singular and plural in the preterite. Once again, all of this work, learning to conjugate in the preterite, took place over 3 lessons. That's fewer than parts of 10 lessons we used to learn the present, but still a fair amount of time to learn to conjugate verbs in just one tense. Now, by this point in the second Learning Spanish course, we've already learned 3 new tenses, and you might have noticed that conjugating verbs in these new tenses has been much easier than the work we did when learning how to conjugate in the present and the preterite. You'll remember that we needed just 1 lesson to learn to conjugate in the imperfect. And this is the case for 2 reasons. In the imperfect, there are only how many sets of endings? 2. One for AR verbs, another for ER and IR verbs. And there are only how many irregular verbs in the imperfect? Right, 3. And those verbs are ser, ir, and ver. Then, we were able to learn to conjugate the present perfect in just 1 lesson. First, we had to learn how to conjugate haber in the present. Next, we had to learn how to form the past participle of regular verbs, which all end in ado or ido, and then learn which verbs have irregular past participles and what those irregular past participles were. But it wasn't actually too much work, and we did it all in 1 lesson. Finally, the most recent tense we learned was the future, which we also learned in 1 lesson. The future has only How many sets of endings? Right, just one set of endings. And these endings are used for all verbs with no exceptions. We also learned that these endings are added to the infinitive of the verb. The only really tricky part about conjugating in the future tense is remembering how many irregular verb stems? 12. So, that's a challenge, but still not too difficult because even those 12 verbs with irregular stems still use regular endings in the future. So, you see on the screen now a chart showing the number of lessons used to learn the 5 verb tenses we've learned so far. Do you see a trend? As shown on the chart, the number of lessons needed to learn to conjugate each of these tenses is most definitely trending downward. In terms of time and effort expended in learning to conjugate verbs, things really are getting easier. So, now, it's time to learn how to conjugate in the conditional tense. And believe it or not, learning to conjugate verbs in the conditional will be even easier than it's been for any verb tense we've looked at so far. How easy? I'm glad you asked. Let's find out. Do you remember that old game show called Name That Tune? Contestants would compete to give the name of a song after hearing only a few notes. So they would bid against each other, saying things like, I can name that tune in 4 notes. Well, now it's time for us to play a game called Conjugate That Verb Tense. And the challenge will be to see in how little time I can teach you to conjugate verbs in the conditional tense. But let's recognize that my teaching is successful only if you learn the conditional as a result of my instruction. So, our game only works if you're able to conjugate verbs in the conditional when we're done. Okay, Bill, you're thinking, we're game to play Conjugate That Verb Tense. Let's give it a go. Are you saying you can teach us to conjugate the conditional in just one lesson? My friends, I can do it in less than one lesson. Well, Professor, could you teach us to conjugate in the conditional in, let's say, half a lesson? Yes, I could, but it would be a serious breach of pedagogical standards. There's no way I need that much time to teach you the conjugation of this new verb tense. Hold on just a moment, mi amigo. What exactly are you saying here? How much time do you think you'll need to teach us to conjugate verbs in the conditional tense? 10 minutes? You underestimate my abilities. 5 minutes? Not even. 4 minutes? Less. We give up, Bill. How much time do you need to teach us to conjugate verbs in the conditional tense? You can learn to conjugate that verb tense in 3 minutes. Es posible? It can't possibly be possible, can it? An entire verb tense conjugation in just 3 minutes? Let's be clear, Profesor de Español, before we enter into this agreement. We're not talking here just about learning to conjugate regular verbs. We're expecting to learn the conditional for all verbs. The regular, the irregular, the slightly irregular. In short, any Spanish verb at all. And you're saying you can show us all that in 180 seconds? Well, students, I'm glad you brought that up. So I'd like to clarify what I'm about to teach so we all understand what's about to happen here. I'm about to teach you how to conjugate any Spanish verb in the conditional tense. You'll be able to conjugate that verb tense after just 3 minutes. That's my final offer. Okay, viewers at home, it's now time for me to teach you the conjugation of all verbs in the conditional tense in just 180 seconds. We'll start the timer at 3 minutes and count down from there. By the time the clock reaches 0, you'll have the almost magical ability to conjugate any verb in Spanish in the conditional tense. No one has ever taught a verb conjugation in so short a time, so you're about to witness history right after this commercial break. Conjugate That Verb Tense is brought to you today by, just kidding, no commercials in this lesson, but I'm not kidding about the 3 minutes, so let's do it. It's time for us to play Conjugate That Verb Tense. Ready, set, begin the timer. To conjugate verbs in the conditional tense, should I speak more quickly? You add endings to the infinitive, just as we did with the future tense. And this is the same for AR, ER, and IR verbs. They all add endings to the infinitive. So what are these endings? They're the imperfect endings for ER and IR verbs that we've already learned. You'll remember that these endings are, repitan, ia, ias, ia, íamos, iais, ian. So, let's conjugate estar in the conditional. But Bill, there's no time, it's too risky. As I said, estar in the conditional is yo estaría, tú estarías, usted estaría, nosotros estaríamos, vosotros estaríais, ellas estarían. Muy bien, you've just conjugated your first verb in the conditional. Let's look at a few more examples. Look at the endings on the screen and say the following verb forms in the conditional. I would speak. Hablaría. We would read is nosotros leeríamos. They would eat. Ellos comerían. This new verb tense will soon be yours. But wait, there's more. What about those pesky irregular verbs? Well, first of all, there are no verbs that use irregular endings. All verbs conjugated in the conditional use the imperfect endings for ER and IR verbs. Are we done? No. There are some verbs with irregular stems in the conditional. Sorry, Professor, but you'll never make it. You have under 2 minutes left, and we don't know how to conjugate irregular verbs. Don't lose faith, estudiantes míos. The verbs that have irregular stems in the conditional are the same 12 verbs that have irregular stems in the future. And the same stem is used in the conditional as in the future. So, using venir, they would come is vendrían. Salir, we would leave. Nosotros saldríamos. Hacer, I would do the work. Yo haría el trabajo. So, here's my quick summary, and it better be quick because I'm running out of time. The conditional is conjugated by adding the same imperfect endings for ER and IR verbs to the infinitive form of the verb. No verbs have irregular endings. The 12 verbs that have irregular stems in the future tense use those same irregular stems in the conditional. Done. We won. Thanks so much for playing Conjugate That Verb Tense. Your prize for winning today is, well, isn't learning its own reward? Now that you can conjugate verbs in this new tense, let's return to some of the examples I gave of the conditional in English. We'll see if you really did learn the conditional in 180 seconds. I'll give you the sentence in English, you give it back to me in Spanish. Okay, here we go. One example I gave was, with more time, they would study more, which in Spanish is, con más tiempo, ellos estudiarían más. Another example we saw was, we would like to visit Chile, which is not so simple, is it? Let's work this one out together. To say simply, we like Chile, would be, nos gusta Chile. So we have the indirect object pronoun nos and the verb gusta in the third person singular of the present. But what we really want to say, of course, is not we like, but we would like. So we'll need to put gusta in the conditional. We would like to visit Chile is nos gustaría visitar Chile. If you're in a store and you want to say, would you help me please? And you'll remember that to help is ayudar. You would say, ¿me ayudaría, por favor? And clearly in this situation, we're using the formal usted form with the store employee. If you're with a good friend, you would use the informal to form of ayudar and say, ¿me ayudarías, por favor? As I noted earlier, the conditional is sometimes used to be polite, which is how we're using it when we ask the store clerk, ¿me ayudaría, por favor? Other examples showing politeness include, ¿Tendría tiempo para trabajar conmigo? Would you have time to work with me? And, ¿nos podría decir dónde está el parque? Would you or could you tell us where the park is? But I need to point out that this use of the conditional, to be polite, is not as common in Spanish as it is in English. If I'm in a restaurant speaking English to a waiter, for example, I might say, I would like the vegetable soup. But if I'm speaking Spanish and tell the waiter, me gustaría la sopa de verduras, he'll probably think, if you'd like it, why don't you order it? So, just be aware that in Spanish, the conditional is used only occasionally to show politeness. You'll be able to see examples of this in the workbook and hear examples of the conditional used to be polite in the speaking activities. Bien, eso fue mucho del condicional. Así que ahora me gustaría cambiar de tema y hablar de algo nuevo, el vocabulario. So, on to new vocabulary it is. In the very first lesson of this course, I introduced you to a number of Spanish verbs that are cognates with verbs in English. I would like to. How would you say I would like to in Spanish? Me gustaría. Do something similar now and begin by introducing you to some more useful cognates. We'll start with verbs and then move on to other parts of speech related to those verbs. And you'll see that these new nouns and adjectives are also cognates. I'll give you the verb in English. You guess what the verb is in Spanish. Whether you guess correctly or not, you should then repeat the verb after I say it in Spanish. We'll start with cognates that are IR verbs. Bien, es hora de aprender unos nuevos verbos. To coincide is coincidir, which also means to agree. To insist, insistir en. To substitute, sustituir. To attribute, atribuir. To reproduce, reproducir. Now, let's learn some new nouns related to those verbs. And remember to say the definite article, el or la, before the noun. Coincidence is la coincidencia. Insistence, la insistencia. Substitution, la sustitución. Substitute, el sustituto. Attribute, el atributo. Reproduction, la reproducción. Now, let's learn some AR verb cognates. To combine, combinar. To complete, completar. To alter, alterar. To admire, admirar. To associate with, asociar. To reveal, revelar. And now, some words related to those verbs. Combination, la combinación. Complete, completo. Alteration, la alteración. Admiration, la admiración. Association, la asociación. Revelation, la revelación. Let me use some of those cognates we already know to congratulate you on your good work with the conditional and with vocabulary in this lesson. In fact, Why don't you repeat after me? Excelente, fenomenal, fantástico. And now, let me finish our vocabulary discussion by adding some new adjectives that express similarly positive sentiments and also happen to be cognates. Repitan. Estupendo, extraordinario, admirable, espectacular, brillante, superior, especial, excepcional. And these are all quite useful adjectives. The next time someone asks you, for instance, ¿Cómo estás? You can respond by saying something like, Estoy muy bien. Es un día extraordinario. Or, if someone says something particularly insightful, you could say, Tu idea es brillante. Finally, when someone asks you how your Spanish studies are progressing, you can answer, Mis estudios están progresando de manera estupenda. Antes de terminar, before finishing esta lección, me gustaría hablar sobre el uso del condicional una vez más. Y digo esto porque hay un uso de este nuevo tiempo verbal que no hemos estudiado todavía y lo vamos a ver ahora. You'll remember that the future tense is used to express something probable in the present. For example, Carlos is probably working a lot. Can be expressed using the future tense, which would be Carlos trabajará mucho. We're using the future tense, but with it we're expressing a probability in the present. Well, like the future, the conditional is also used to express something uncertain but probable. The difference is that while the future expresses something probable in the present, the conditional expresses something probable in the past. Let's look at a few examples of the conditional used in this way. What we're going to do is conjugate verbs in the conditional and use this new verb tense to express something that probably happened at some point in the past. Example, they probably arrived at 6 o'clock would be llegarían a las 6. To say, I wonder who they were, you would ask, ¿Quiénes serían? One more. Let's say there was a party. I'm not sure when it ended, but I think it probably ended after midnight. I can express this using the conditional and saying, the party probably ended after midnight, which would be, la fiesta terminaría después de medianoche. Time to bring this lesson to its conclusion, or, as we say in Spanish, su conclusión. We learned during our game show that the conditional is quite easy to conjugate. As is the case with the future tense, the conditional endings are added to the infinitive, and the endings themselves are the same as the ER and IR endings of what tense? The imperfect. No verb uses irregular endings. Some verbs do have irregular stems in the conditional. Fortunately, these irregular stems are exactly the same irregular stems we saw when we learned what tense? The future. Beyond using the conditional to express something that would happen, this new verb tense is also used to express probability in the past. Muy bien, esta lección ha llegado a su conclusión. Hasta pronto.
Glosario en audio. Lección 17.
Give the Spanish for the following English words. Then repeat the Spanish word. Conditional.
Condicional.
To coincide. To agree.
Coincidir.
Coincidence.
La coincidencia.
To insist.
insistir en.
Insistence.
La insistencia.
To substitute.
Sustituir.
Substitution.
La sustitución.
Substitute.
El sustituto.
To attribute.
Atribuir.
Attribute.
El atributo.
To reproduce.
Reproducir.
Reproduction.
La reproducción.
To combine.
Combinar.
Combination.
La combinación.
To complete.
Completar.
Complete.
Completo.
To alter.
Alterar.
Alteration.
La alteración.
To admire.
Admirar.
Admiration.
La admiración.
To associate with.
Asociar.
Association.
La asociación.
To reveal.
Revelar.
Revelation.
La revelación.
Stupendous.
Estupendo.
Extraordinary.
Extraordinario.
Admirable.
Admirable.
Spectacular.
Espectacular.
Brilliant.
Brillante.
Superior.
Superior.
Special.
Especial.
Exceptional.
Excepcional. Actividades de conversación. Lección 17.
Conjugate the following verbs in the indicated tense. For example, vivir, tú, pretérito perfecto.
Has vivido.
Tener, yo, pretérito.
Tuve.
Empezar, tú, condicional.
Empezarías.
Investigar, el, presente.
Investiga.
Describir, ellos, pretérito.
Describieron.
Concluir, nosotros, pretérito.
Concluimos.
Insistir, ella, pretérito perfecto.
Ha insistido.
Hablar, vosotros, condicional.
Hablaríais.
Estudiar, yo, futuro.
Estudiaré.
Invitar, tú, futuro.
Invitarás.
Conducir, ustedes, pretérito.
Condujeron.
Mirar, ella, condicional.
Miraría.
Llamar, yo, pretérito perfecto.
He llamado.
Comer, vosotros, pretérito perfecto.
Habéis comido.
Jugar, el, presente.
Juega.
Recomendar, yo, condicional.
Recomendaría.
Dividir, ustedes, pretérito.
Dividieron.
Leer, nosotros, pretérito perfecto.
Hemos leído.
Decir, vosotros, pretérito.
Dijisteis.
Informar, tú, futuro.
Informarás.
Poder, yo, pretérito.
Pude.
Buscar, nosotros, condicional.
Buscaríamos.
Hacer, ellas, pretérito perfecto.
Han hecho.
Vivir, el, presente.
Vive.
Salir, yo, futuro.
Saldré.
Esperar, usted, futuro.
Esperará.
Listen to the following conversation between Alejandro and Bill, and then answer the questions cierto for true and falso for false.
¿Qué vas a hacer el fin de semana?
No estoy seguro. Debería ir a visitar a mi primo. Siempre me dice que lo visite y no lo hago.
¿Vive muy lejos tu primo?
No mucho, como a 3 horas de mi casa.
No está mal. Solo son 3 horas. Pienso que deberías ir a visitarlo. Entonces, ¿lo visitarás este fin de semana?
Debería, pero no sé. Me gustaría ir, pero no estoy seguro. Él vive en un pueblo muy pequeño y no hay muchas cosas que hacer.
Es una situación difícil, pero él probablemente se siente muy solo. ¿Cuándo fue la última vez que lo visitaste?
Hace como 4 años.
¡Qué terrible! Yo que tú iría inmediatamente a ver a tu primo.
Sí, tienes razón. Creo que lo visitaré este sábado. ¿Qué vas a hacer tú el fin de semana?
Mm, si no vas a estar aquí el fin de semana, me gustaría salir con tu hermana a cenar.
Bill siempre visita a su primo.
Falso.
El pueblo donde vive el primo de Bill es muy pequeño.
Cierto.
Alejandro piensa que Bill debería ir a visitar a su primo inmediatamente.
Cierto.
Bill visitó a su primo hace 4 años.
Cierto.
Hay muchas cosas que hacer en el pueblo donde vive el primo de Bill.
Falso.
El pueblo del primo de Bill está a 2 horas de distancia.
Falso.
Say if the following sentences express something probable in the present or in the past. For example,
Llegarían a las 8 de la noche.
probable in the past.
¿Quién será esa muchacha?
Probable in the present.
Este pastel está delicioso. ¿Lo prepararían ellas mismas?
Probable in the past.
La familia Quirós compró una casa en Cancún. ¿Tendrán mucho dinero?
Probable in the present.
Sé que José está enfermo. ¿Quién trabajará en su lugar?
Probable in the present.
Ella habla español muy bien. ¿Viajaría a Latinoamérica?
Probable in the past.
Vicky llegó temprano esta mañana. ¿Tomaría el tren de las 6?
Probable in the past.
Son las 8 de la mañana. Tengo hambre. ¿A qué hora abrirán el restaurante?
Probable in the present.
Alberto llegó en autobús esta mañana. ¿Vendería su carro?
Probable in the past.
Me divertí mucho en la fiesta de anoche, pero Andrea no. ¿Estaría enfadada?
Probable in the past.